Hey everyone, this is the Spoon Dude, and we're continuing the customizing process. Now I'm sculpting and painting my Spider-Man No Way Home Final Suit Spider-Man. For sculpting, I use Milliput Epoxy Putty, a 2-part sculpting clay that takes 3 to 4 hours to dry. After mixing equal portions of each part, the material is quite easy to work with, especially when you have water handy. I use my blade and toothpicks as my sculpting quote-unquote tools. There are real tools that people use for sculpting, but I find that these work just fine for me. Unfortunately, I didn't get to record much footage of me sculpting. I was able to take the pictures of just the, finished sculpting before paint. Here you can see the logos that I sculpted. I tried to be as fine as I could given the sleek, thin logo designs. They're not perfectly accurate, they're maybe too big and not as perfectly symmetrical as they should be, which is something I always seem to struggle with my, freehand sculpting. This seems to be the best that I could do under my current skill. Something I am happy with is how relatively flat the logos are. Outside the logos, the rest of the sculpting involves filling out the areas that I had cut away, and then continuing the sculpted web lines. Of course, the Homecoming Spider-Man arms had the black bands that interrupted the web pattern. I previously carved out those sections so that I could come back in with the epoxy putty. The big concern with this is that while I might be able to carry the web lines over relatively easily, they are just lines after all, couldn't really carry over the texture that convincingly. I found that the texture on the figure was just a little bit too subtle that trying to make an impression on some clay didn't really make much of an impression, so I couldn't really apply the texture on the parts that I sculpted. Now, luckily, if you recall from a previous part, since I had applied a little bit too much acetone on the arms to get rid of the paint, I also ended up taking off some of the texture of the figure, which meant that on the arms there was barely any texture left. That once I came in with my sculpting to fill in some areas, I didn't actually have to go back in and add the texture on the sculpted parts. So in a weird way, my mistake with the acetone actually kind of worked out perfectly since the arms were kind of already smooth to begin with. Now you will notice as I showed the dry sculpt, I did jump ahead and already paint some of the blue parts as I was sculpting the red sections. This is because I'm impatient as heck. This is the metallic blue that I used, which was the same metallic blue that I had utilized for my custom Ultimate Spider-Man. I had another metallic blue I thought might work better, but after doing a quick test on the lower legs, I found that the original blue I had was still the best choice. It surprisingly matches the shade and sheen of the blue in the film quite well. This blue applies pretty nicely, only needing a few coats to be a solid color. I avoided using a primer or doing a base coat because I rationalized that would mean less layers of paint and that would be better to fight paint rub. This was kind of a mistake. Once all the sculpted parts dried, I got ready to paint red. This is where I really should have used the primer. I figured I didn't want to apply my white primer to the untouched parts of the figure. They're already red, so I just need to paint red on the sculpted parts. That was dumb. I really should have used the primer, which should have tied all the colors of the figure to be one even color. That would make painting much easier and require less coats of paint for everything to look consistent. Do as I say, not as I do. I didn't do that, so I just directly went in with my brush and tried to paint all the red portions with just the red paint that I had. I started with this cheap bright red, which after a few coats really seemed like it wouldn't work out. The paint quality didn't seem all that great. It was super thin and watered down. The color seemed a bit too bright. The parts that were already red on the figure weren't really brightening up, and then the parts that I had sculpted, the white sections that I had to paint red, were never darkening up enough. I decided to switch to this cadmium red from a different brand, and this worked a lot better. It still required hella coats to make everything look more cohesive, and even then, if you look closely enough, you can notice the difference between the molded red plastic and the parts I sculpted. However, I got to a point where it wasn't so crazy noticeable at a regular distance. Just in hand, the red looks fairly consistent. You have to get really close to it to notice the difference. Maybe a few more coats could have made everything a solid color even at a close distance. However, I was also trying to avoid having too many coats of red paint because then that might be a little bit too easy to flake off. Painting the logos was tricky. I complained that I sculpted them too big, but even then, they're still quite thin. And, you know, relative to a regular human size, they're still pretty small that it's tricky to paint them cleanly. While I was painting, I tried to use the paint to hide some of the inconsistencies of the sculpted logos. You know, whether it be thickening a line that I sculpted too thin, or painting it a little bit past the sculpted line so that the points were a little bit sharper and more even looking. You can be the judge on whether I was successful in hiding the flaws of the logo's sculpt. I went with a gloss black for the front logo, and then the red on the back is just the same as the rest of the figure. On to the web lines. This figure has sculpted webs, so I could have used a black wash to paint them. However, it was important to me that I maintain a relatively clean look. I wanted the red to remain as bright and vibrant as it could be. Same with the blue as well. If you look in the movie, the colors are super saturated, super comic booky, and I felt that if I applied a black wash to the red portions, that would kind of muddy it up too much, make it look too dirty. It works well for painting like a comic book Spider-Man that I want to be kind of grittier, kind of more modern looking, but for this version of Spider-Man, the black wash didn't really seem like it would fit. So instead, I decided to fill the web lines in using a fine-tipped micron pen, which is also how I draw the web lines on other Spider-Man customs. The thinnest size point that I have is a 0.20 millimeter, which is thin enough to fit into the channels of the sculpted webbing. The fact that the webbing is sculpted also means it's fairly easy to remain clean and consistent. You're just taking that pen and running it through the sculpted channels and just filling in what's already laid out for you. I will say though, on the shoulders and lower arms where I had to fill in some of the sculpt myself, the lines that I had sculpted I guess weren't as deep as the ones that are on the figure, and then add on top the layers of red paint that I put. Some of the sculpt that I put there isn't really so noticeable, and I had to kind of guess where the web line should be. If you look really closely, it's noticeable that not all the webs are etched in as deeply as other web lines. And then on the back of the spider belt, you'll notice that the web lines aren't sculpted at all. This is because I'm lazy and only sculpted the web lines on the sides of the belt on the front. And with that, once I was done drawing in the web lines, the final step was just applying a clear coat over everything to seal it in. The clear coat helps to prevent some paint wear just from handling the figure. It won't prevent paint rub, but it will prevent paint scratches just from regular handling or the figure happening to fall every once in a while. It's also really important for the metallic paint, especially as I found at least this kind of metallic paint that might be a little bit on the cheaper side. It has the glittery flakes that give the metallic sheen, but without a paint sealer, these flakes can kind of come off and just get everywhere. But once you add that clear coat, it should remain all on the figure. And that pretty much concludes the process for the making of my custom final suit Spider-Man from Spider-Man No Way Home. Like before, I post a short showcase showing the final product in a bit more detail, whereas this series of videos was meant to be more about the making of process. For those who stuck with me through this series, thank you so much for watching. If you missed the previous parts, be sure to check them out, linked in the suggested videos or the description below. Anyways, thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing. I'll see you in my next video.